So as we saw in the lecture, when we create a class, Python automatically builds properties and behaviors into our class object, right? Into the class itself, into the type. Like, for example, making it callable, so we can create instances of that class. Or a property, like, for example, the DunDoName property. So just recall, we create a class by using the class keyword. So that now is basically defining a new type, a new class called person. And I'm just going to pass, I'm not going to do anything. But as we saw before, we already have a name property. So we can add our own attributes to classes. Now, one way of doing that is by defining it directly in the class itself. So let's go ahead and create a new type called program. And now I'm going to put in a few attributes, data attributes in this class. So we'll make program language equal to Python and the program version equal to 3.6. So now that I have this class, well, it is a class, it's a type. So I can look at the name, right? That's provided for us by default. I can look at the type of program, which by now you should know is going to be type because we've defined a new type, a new class. But program is an object. So we can access properties or attributes of that class using, for example, the dot notation. So we can access the language, like so. We can access the, for example, version, like so as well. Now we can also set the version, so or any of those attributes, in fact. So I'm going to set the version. So program.version equals 3.7, for example. And now if I look at the version, you'll see that it is indeed 3.7. So we mutated the attribute value inside the program class. So again, I want to emphasize, like I emphasized in the lecture, here we are not looking at instances of this class yet. Everything that we're doing is basically dealing with the class that is itself an object. So we can set and retrieve attributes on any object, in particular classes as well. So we use the dot notation, but we also have functions that we can use to do exactly the same thing. So we can get the attribute, so we use this function called getAttr, and we have to specify the type that we want to get the attribute from. But in fact, it's not really the type. We have to specify the object that we want to get the attribute value. And we specify now in a string the attribute that we want to get. So in this case, we get the attribute program version and we get 3.7 back. And we can use the set attribute function as well, and it works very much in the same way. We can go ahead and set the version and say the version is 3.6 again. And now if we get the attribute again, and we can either use that or use dot notation, it doesn't matter, it's the same thing, then we get 3.6 back once I fix my typo, like so. Now there is also another form of the getAttribute function, which is what happens if we try and retrieve an attribute that doesn't exist in the object. So we can look at getAttribute program, let's say, and let's get the attribute X. Now if we do that, we're going to get an exception. We're going to get this attribute error that the type of object program has no attribute X. So what we can do, if we don't want that exception to generate, we can go ahead and provide a default value. So here I'm going to use a string as a default return so we can actually see it. Very often we'll use none, but it kind of depends on what you're trying to do in your program. But as you can see, since X was not an attribute of program, it returned NA instead. Now this is, of course, not limited to classes, right? This getAttribute, setAttribute is really for any attribute of any object. So we can use it on other objects as well. If we want to get, let's say, the attribute from a string object, let's say hello, and we want to get its X attribute, and if it's not there, go ahead and return NA, okay, like so. Then as you can see, it works exactly the same way. But since classes are objects, we can use the getAttribute and setAttribute and the dot notation to access attributes. Now, Python is a dynamic language, which means that at runtime, so in other words, after the class or the object has been defined, we can add and remove properties from that object. Now, not all objects support that. The built-ins, for example, you can't do it. But if we look, for example, at this program class, it doesn't have the X property, the X attribute. But I can go ahead and define it. I can say program.x equals 100. That worked just fine. And if I look at program.x, or if I do getAttr on program with X, you'll see that it's actually now defined. That object has that attribute X. Now, we cannot do that with built-ins, for example. We cannot go ahead and say, for example, that the string hello, let me go ahead and create a symbol, a equals hello, okay? We cannot go ahead and say a dot x equals 100. That's not going to work. And we can't do that with the types either. So string dot x equals 100, that's not going to work, okay? So we cannot do that with the built-ins, but we can certainly do that with our own objects. So that's really how very often we actually deal with objects in Python. We might create the class, and then later we add attributes to that same class. Now, where is the state of these things stored? Well, there's different places that can happen, but in general, the state of an object is stored in a dictionary. And we'll see that there are exceptions to that, and we'll get to that throughout this course. But for now, let's take a look at, let's say, our program class that we defined. Well, it has yet another attribute that is defined by Python for us, the dunderDict attribute. And if we look at that, we'll see that it is this thing called a mapping proxy. So the object type is a mapping proxy. When we access this attribute, we get this type back. And essentially think of it as a read-only dictionary. And as you can see, we have key value pairs in here. So for example, we know that this class is defined in the main module. It has a dictionary, which is actually what we're looking at right now. And it has some attributes. It has language, Python, version 3.6, and X 100. So as you can see, the state, basically the attributes that we are storing on the object, we can find them in that dictionary, in this mapping proxy. So if we change the value of an attribute, let's say we just say set attribute, and I'll use the function. I could also use the dot notation. It doesn't really matter. Dot notation, of course, is easier to write, easier to read. Sometimes when you're working in code, you actually get your property names maybe from somewhere else, and you get it as a string. In that case, you would use these functions, setAttr, getAttr, deleteAttr if you want to delete the attribute, and we'll get to that in a minute. So for now, I'm just going to use the functions because I'm sure you've seen the dot notation often, and I want you to get used to seeing also the functions that we can use to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to set the attribute x, I'm going to set it to negative 100. So now if I look at the program dictionary, so at the state, you can see that x now has a value of negative 100. So we've seen now how with any object, basically, especially the ones that we create, now the built-in ones, of course, as I showed you, it's different, but the objects that we create, so for example, this program object, which is a class, but it's an object, we are able to change the state of that object. We can add attributes, remove attributes, change attributes, and so on. So let me show you how we can remove an attribute. There's two ways we can do this. Let's say that I want to delete the X attribute. So there's a function called delete attribute, del_attr, and I can basically pass it the object that I want to delete the attribute from and the name of the attribute that I want to delete. So now if I look at the state of the object, you can see that X is now gone. It's no longer in there. Now, there's other ways we can delete as well. So let me go ahead and add an attribute again. So this time I'm going to use dot notation. So I'm going to say program.y equals hello, for example. Now, if I look at program_dict, you can see that y is in the dictionary. It's right here. And I can delete it now using the del keyword. So del, and I can just say del program.y. Remove the attribute y from the state, or that if you want to think of it as a dictionary, from the dictionary that contains the state for program. So just go ahead and delete that attribute. And now if we look at the dictionary again, you can see that it's gone. It does the same thing as the delete attribute function. So as I said, this is really a mapping proxy. Think of it as a read-only dictionary. So technically, if we want to access something in that dictionary, we can use it, and we can actually access it just like we would access any value given a key for a dictionary. So for example, we can look at the language key that's in that dictionary. And as you can see, it returns the value that's stored in for language. So it returns Python. And in fact, you can do things like, for example, you can say list program dict dot items, right? We can get items out of a dictionary, and that's going to return a tuple or a list of tuples that's going to contain the key value pairs. Well, the same thing happens here, right? So dot items is going to give us a generator that's going to be tuples of the key value pairs. I iterate through them using list, and we end up with this over here, which is kind of what we saw over here. So this dict behaves like a dictionary. The thing is, you can't make modifications to it. So if I try and change the language here and say this is equal to Java, we're going to get a runtime exception. It's going to tell us that the mapping proxy object doesn't support item assignment. Yes, it's basically read-only. Now, one word of caution. As I mentioned, this dictionary gives us kind of an insight into the state of a particular object. But not everything that makes up the state of an object is actually located in that dictionary. For example, we know that the done_name property is a property of program, right? So we can look at program done_name. That has a value. It has a value, which is this string program. And yet, it is not in this dictionary here. So be careful, not everything is stored in the dictionary. Things can be stored in other places as well. And we'll see where that happens and how things are stored as we progress throughout this course. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.